So welcome to renewable energy options for servicing commercial property. With the clear drive towards all things green and the Scottish Government's Heat and Buildings Bill, which we are promised will appear by the end of the year, a bill that will introduce powers to introduce minimum energy efficiency standards for commercial property, and also may require larger commercial properties and public buildings to join heat networks. Now is the time to be considering what might be suitable for your property or what might not. Today, we have our speakers, Callum Mackenzie, one of our senior associates in our real estate team, and Sarah Jane MacArthur, one of the partners in our energy and infrastructure team. And with that, I'll hand over to Sarah Jane to set the scene. Sarah Jane.
Thanks, Catherine. So just an outline of what we're going to cover today. As Catherine said, I'll do some scene setting, and then Callum is going to take us through some property considerations. I'll then walk through some low carbon power options and some low carbon heat options for your properties. So moving on to some scene setting. And just on the next slide, why are we here? Firstly, climate change. Hopefully, we can all agree that this is driving the need to decarbonise. The UK government and Scottish government have set net zero targets, 2050 in the UK and 2045 in Scotland, which is just 20 years away. Regulation is coming, as Catherine has hinted at already, with energy performance and building standards and the new Heat and Buildings Bill, and those will all require action to be taken. There's also a demand from consumers and customers for green products and to buy from companies with strong ESG credentials that are driving action in this area. And decarbonising our economy requires action from all sectors. The built environment is a large part of that. The Committee on Climate Change, who last month published its carbon budgets for Scotland, identified this as one of two key sectors for decarbonisation to meet the carbon budgets over the next decade. And at the same time, achieving those further emissions reductions is getting harder as the focus moves from electricity grid decarbonisation to electrifying heat and transport. So today we're going to focus on the low carbon options for heat and power to commercial properties to try and help support these ambitions. So I'll hand over to Callum to talk us through some property considerations.
Thanks, Sarah Jane, and thank you everyone for joining the webinar today. My name's Callum Mackenzie. I'm a senior associate at Brodie's and I'm qualified in Scots and English law. My main practice is acting for investors and landlords in buying commercial buildings and their ongoing asset management, but I've also been involved in renewable energy projects for wind and solar and also battery storage. Sarah Jane will be on later again to discuss the different renewable energy options, which can range from simple things like switching to a green power tariff, all the way through to installing your own renewable energy infrastructure and generating your own power at the building. That infrastructure could be things like solar panels, wind turbines or heat pumps, amongst lots of other things. And she'll come back on to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of each option. But first, what are some of the general commercial and property matters to consider when deciding whether a renewable energy option is right for your building? So, as you might expect, there's lots of different factors that come to it here. So, first of all, we've got the grid connection. So, the availability and costs of grid connection will determine whether or not physical infrastructure will be able to be installed at the building. After an application to the grid operator, the grid connection offer will provide details of the works required to connect your infrastructure and the costs involved. If you or your client are going to install equipment at the building, who's going to pay for the costs of that and who's going to pay for the cost of the equipment itself? So installing renewable energy infrastructure and generating the power at the building yourself would mean that you purchase the equipment and install the equipment and you bear all the initial costs of that, as well as the grid connection costs and the ongoing repair costs. On the other hand, you or your client will also get the price benefits of any electricity cost savings or keeping all the income from selling the excess energy to the grid. The alternative option is a third-party installation. This is where a third-party supplier installs all the equipment at their cost. they're also responsible for the grid connection costs and the ongoing repair and management of the equipment. Under this arrangement, the third-party supplier would take a lease of part of the property to install the equipment, and the owner or landlord will enter into a power purchase agreement with the supplier to buy a minimum amount of electricity generated by the equipment at a specific fixed price. Another factor to consider is generating capacity. So what space can you allocate to the renewable infrastructure? For example, if you want to install solar panels and the intention is to put these on the roof of the building, how big is the roof and what weight can the roof bear? The generating capacity of the infrastructure determines how much electricity will be available for consumption at the building and how much will be available to be sold to the grid. Another factor is price certainty against long-term price upsides. So are you an owner, occupier, or a landlord under, are you an owner, occupier, landlord, or occupier under a lease? Do you have multiple properties? Depending on which category your client falls into, will impact on the commercial considerations. So there are some people who would want to produce or use green energy regardless of what the cost of that might involve, but most people will weigh up the benefits of the green credentials against any costs that they might incur. For example, if your client is an owner-occupier, they might be able to take a longer view on the upfront costs of installing renewable power versus the long-term price certainty on the electricity costs and long-term energy cost savings, knowing that the money you've paid out upfront for the infrastructure might only pay out in 10 to 15 years in the future. Alternatively, if your client is a landlord, your main consideration might be evidencing green credentials to tenants by supplying renewable energy or getting price certainty on the electricity that's supplied to the common areas so that the level of service charge is more predictable. Another consideration for a landlord might be the capital value they can add to the property, e.g. you might want to sell the electricity generated to the grid, which would allow the landlord to capitalise that as an income stream and increase the value of the building. And lastly, if you're an occupier under a lease, a lot depends on how long your lease lasts and how much of an investment you would want to make into the premises that you might not always be in or occupying. Just on to the next slide, please. So on the specific property considerations, again, your freedom to act and choose what option you want to go for depends on whether your client is an owner-occupier, a landlord of a multi-let property, or an occupier under a lease. So if you're an owner-occupier, subject to the usual planning and building permissions and obtaining a grid connection offer, which I mentioned earlier, you will generally have the most freedom to do what you want to the property. If you're a landlord that has occupational tenants, and if we take an example of installing solar panels at the building, where are these panels going to sit? Generally, they would either sit on the roof of the building or in part of the car park. So you need to check that a third party doesn't already have a lease of the relevant part of the roof or the car park where the panels are intending to go. Most multi-let properties will have internal only lease demises, but if the leases have a structural demise, then part of the roof could be included in the leases, and so you would not be able to put the equipment there. On the car park, another key thing to check is whether there's any tenants have a guaranteed minimum number of car parking spaces, and then if installing the panels at the car park would bring that number below the minimum threshold. The other factors to consider are, do you have sufficient rights of access to grant access to the areas where the equipment is going to be installed, and also grant rights to lay all the relevant service media to connect the equipment to the grid. And lastly, if you're a tenant occupier, what does your lease say on alterations? It's likely that landlord consent is required to installing the panels. And if you wanted to do a private wire power purchase agreement, which Sarah Jane will talk a bit more about later on, that would need a lease to a third-party supplier. So what does your lease say about underlettings? Your location and type of property. Sorry, if you just go back one slide. Perfect. Where's the property located? For example, is in the city centre where it might be difficult to physically access the premises for installation of equipment? Is it multi-let, single occupancy? Is it new? Is it old? All these things are things to think about. And along with those general considerations, there's obviously the requirements to get planning permissions, building warrants, If you have a lender, then installation of any equipment is likely going to be required. Consent from the lender is likely to be required under any facility agreement, or if there are tenants at the property and the equipment would affect the common parts, then the relevant leases should be checked to see whether the landlord can change the common parts to allow for the equipment to be installed. Next slide, please. So if you or your client opt to have a third party take a lease of part of the property to install the equipment and purchase the energy from the supplier under a power purchase agreement, then some specific considerations to think about in the lease and the power purchase agreement itself are things like the PPA and the lease need to work together hand in hand to cover the purchase of the energy, the installation and maintenance of the equipment, and they need to be consistent with each other. The maintenance and repair of the equipment. So under the lease, the third-party supplier will be responsible for repairing and insuring the equipment. The landlord will be required to maintain the building that the equipment is placed on, and all of these rights will have to be reserved in any lease. So forfeiture or termination of the power purchase agreement in the lease. If either the lease or the PPA is terminated early, this should be a trigger for the other agreement to also be terminated. The wording should be looked at carefully to make sure the agreements tie together on this point and what happens to the equipment left. For example, it's common that if the documents are terminated early due to the fault of the landlord, that there is an obligation on the landlord to buy the equipment back from the supplier so that the supplier's investment is made good. The buyback cost of the equipment decreases each year that the lease continues and gradually reaches a £0 buyback cost at the end of the lease term. What happens to the equipment at the end of the term is usually a matter of negotiation between the parties, but generally we found the requirement is to remove it unless the landlord says otherwise. On alterations, the lease will allow for the supplier to install the equipment. And this will likely be by reference to a specification of works that details exactly where the equipment will be installed and the routes of any service media. Subsequent alterations to the equipment are likely to require the consent of the landlord. The terms of any guarantees should also be checked. For example, if the equipment is being installed on the roof, it is common that there would be a roof guarantee, and it usually says that if you carry out works to the roof that are not in line with the provisions of the guarantee or with the guarantor's consent, the guarantee will be invalidated. As, for example, solar panels would go on the roof, the supplier must be obliged to comply with all provisions of the guarantee, including carrying out any works in accordance with the guarantor's requirements. Restrictions on transfer of the lease and the PPA. Due to the regulatory requirements of buying and selling electricity, which Sarah Jane will touch on later, the alienation provisions in the lease will be tight and on very limited grounds. The lease should also include a requirement that if the lease is assigned, then the PPA also needs to be assigned to the same party and vice versa. If the landlord sells the property, the lease will automatically be binding on the future owners, but the new owner will likely be required to sign a PPA on the same terms as the existing one. The lease will usually allow the supplier to charge the lease to their funder, and will also usually contain a requirement that the landlord enters into a direct agreement with the funder as part of the tenant's security package. And then lift and shift. Again, this is a commercial point for negotiation between the parties, but the landlord will likely want to include an ability to change the location of the equipment if they carry out redevelopment or alterations at the building, or include an option to terminate the lease. Again, this would usually trigger a penalty or a buyback requirement. For routine repairs to the building, the lease should include a requirement on the tenant to remove the equipment if it's necessary, and whether this will trigger a penalty will be a matter for negotiation. So that's a very brief run through of some of the commercial and property considerations to take into account when deciding if a renewable energy option is right for your building. I'm going to pass it back over to Sarah Jane now, who will discuss the different renewable energy options in more detail.
Great, thanks very much, Callum. We'll just pause here for a second. I'm going to start on low carbon power options, but I did want to explain that I'm going to look at this in two segments. I'll focus first on how you get the low carbon power, generating it or buying it for your own consumption, and then how you might supply any excess low carbon power. For example, supplying excess power you've generated or that you've bought. The rules and regulations in the electricity market are quite different for generation, distribution, and supply. So that's why I'm going to look at them slightly separately. So on the next slide, with apologies, I have a big red warning stamp. That's just to reiterate that today the focus is on commercial properties. Supplies to domestic properties are much more heavily regulated and the regulations are a bit more complex. So it requires more specialist advice than we can cover in the scope of this webinar. So take the warning. Today's about commercial properties. If you want to look at domestic properties, come and speak to us. So moving on to the low carbon power options. I've started at the top with the simple ones and moved down to the more complicated ones. The simplest of all options is just do nothing and wait for the grid to decarbonise. UK government have a clean power mission to deliver clean power by 2030. I suppose the question mark is whether they're going to hit that, given the need to electrify heat and transport, which makes that target all the more difficult. I'm not going to discuss that one further as it doesn't need any legal input. The second one there, switch to a green power tariff. Again, that's another simple option. Just contact your supplier or find a new supplier who offers a green tariff. The electrons that actually supply your property might not be green, but the supplier will guarantee to buy renewable power equivalent to your consumption on the market. These are pretty standard PPAs in the market, and I don't propose to discuss it any further on the basis that you'll be glad to hear you don't need to call the lawyers for that one. The next three I will discuss in a bit more detail. Those are a corporate PPA, sometimes referred to as a sleeving arrangement, a private wire PPA, or installing your own renewable power generation. So moving on to the corporate PPA. What is a corporate PPA or a sleeving arrangement? It's a long-term contract between a business customer and a renewable power generator to buy the renewable power generated by that generator. They're often fixed price long-term contracts. With the corporate PPA, the power sale is virtual because the generation is remote from the customer, and so the power simply flows onto and off the grid. Similarly to the green tariff, the electrons you receive at your property won't be green, but you're buying green electrons at the other end to match your consumption. This therefore requires a back-to-back agreement or a sleeve with a licensed electricity supplier, and that supplier will physically trade the power on the market and ensure that you receive the power when you need it, not just when the renewable power is generated. The benefits of this arrangement are it's relatively simple to implement in the sense that they are now established form of contracts, and some electricity suppliers actually actively market sleeving arrangements. It also provides price stability, and there's the potential to improve ESG credibility because you can say you're supporting specific renewable generation. Some things to think about. It does require more negotiation and a bit more thought than a simple grid supply agreement, so you have to factor in the setup cost and time for that. These are generally long-term contracts, so 10 to 15 years. So you need to think about your power demand over time, have some certainty around that, and also to consider whether you need break options or flexibility. They do tend to be more suited to large customers with high power demands across multiple sites. So we've seen corporate PPAs in the market from Tesco, Google, Marks and Spencer's, BT, but they are still suitable for smaller properties too. There are aggregators out there who can match make between customers and generators. And the other thing to bear in mind is that although fixed price arrangements give you long-term stability, they will sometimes be out of the money if electricity prices fall. So if you move on to private wire PPAs, this again is a long-term contract between the business customer and a renewable power generator to buy the power. Again, it's often fixed price. The main difference here is that the power sale is physical or direct because the generation is either on the same site as the customer or immediately adjacent to the customer. So the power is not being transported over the grid at all, but via cables owned by the generator or customers, hence private wires. This is more suitable for customers who have a large demand on a particular site that can use the power directly, such as distilleries. For example, the Macallan have set up a private wire supply from a solar farm installed by EDF next door. We've also seen sawmills buying from adjacent biomass plants, or it could simply refer to on the smaller scale to solar panels on the roof of a shopping centre. The main benefit of a private wire PPA is reduced electricity cost. By using the private wire means that you save on non-commodity costs such as grid charges and green levies, and this is obviously often the main driver for doing one of these projects. You also have the price stability that comes with the fixed price arrangement, assuming that's what has been offered. And again, even more improved ESG credibility because these contracts often support development of a specific renewable project and involves the direct supply of green electrons. And that might be particularly relevant to you if you're manufacturing a green product, so you can see that it was actually produced by green electricity. Some things to think about. Private wire PPA terms are often very bespoke. It's difficult to benchmark terms and pricing in the market, and it will require negotiation, and it needs to be bespoke to fit your situation. The supply of power needs to fit within an electricity supply license exemption. The supply exemption is more of an issue for the supplier than the customer, but it does affect the commercial benefit, i.e. those non-commodity costs that I talked about. And I will talk a little bit more about license exemption in a moment in the context of supply. You need to think about who's going to provide that backup power when the renewable power is unavailable. Are you going to maintain your own grid supply point, or will the generator provide you with top up? And what happens to any surplus power? Does it get exported to the grids? Through whose infrastructure would that happen? Or does it get sold to other customers, in which case who gets priority? Often there'll be a minimum offtake, as Callum mentioned, or we call them take or pay arrangements, and those are required to support the capital investment in the project, particularly if you're the only customer. As with the corporate PPA, they're generally long-term contracts, so 10 to 15 years or so to cover the life of the generating assets. So again, you need long-term certainty over your power demand, and you'll need to consider whether you need a break option or flexibility. And as Callum alluded to, the termination payments can be substantial as you're often needing to repay the capital investment, albeit that depreciates over time. So then moving on to renewable generation, building your own. As it suggests, this involves you as the owner occupier installing, owning, operating your renewable power on site to meet your power needs. Plenty of examples of this, most commonly solar panels on the roof or car park or an adjacent land, but also even an AD plant generating power from on-site processes, or if you're more rural, perhaps wind or hydro installations. The benefits of doing this is that it's a bespoke solution tailored to your property, your needs. You can choose what it is you want to do. Also, any profit that comes out of generation is entirely for the property owner. Of course, if you benefit in all of the upsides, you're subject to the downside risk. Again, improved ESG credibility probably to the max here, because what you're doing is creating additional renewable power generation and having that direct use of the green electricity. In terms of things to think about, this does mean you have to make the upfront capital investment, so you need to consider the payback period. It is a long-term commitment to the site to achieve that payback, so it needs to be considered alongside your estate strategy. This is likely to be non-core business, so you need to think about whether you've got the necessary skills and experience and the cost of potentially buying that in. As I mentioned, if you're the project owner, you take full project risk, so risk of defects, maintenance, repair costs, compliance. You'll still need to consider backup power arrangements. That's likely to be maintaining a grid supply point, but bear in mind you might not get as good a deal for the power that you buy in from the grids because you'll be buying less. And you might also want to consider storage solutions to maximise the use of the renewable generation where possible. And then you need to think about what happens to the surplus power. Will you export it back to the grids or sell it to other customers? Which leads me nicely on to the next section. So, and apologies for the red on this slide as well, but supplying electricity without a license or a license exemption is a criminal offence. Various exemptions apply, but they're complex and arbitrary. I should also note the generation of electricity is regulated, but the exemptions are broad and relatively easy to satisfy unless you're building something bigger than 50 megawatts, which is pretty big. On the supply license exemptions, class exemptions are given automatically, so suppliers need to satisfy themselves as to whether they fit within an exemption or not. This means there's very little visibility in the market as to what's compliant or not, with almost no case law interpretation and very limited Ofgem and government guidance. And we also are aware that these rules are potentially subject to change. Ofgem published a call for evidence in 2020 and then published a summary of the responses received in 2023. So far, no specific action has been taken. We know that they have other priorities, but this is clearly still under review, and we expect Ofgem to revisit this at some point. So how I've approached this is I have applied our red, amber, green risk rating to the various supply options, starting from the bottom up. Exporting power to the grid is the simplest option. That's not supply, so you don't need a license. So if you've got surplus power and you want to just export it, that's relatively straightforward. The next two in amber do need to fit within a license exemption, but there are relatively well-established routes to do that if you keep it simple. So there is an exemption if you buy power from the grid, standard PPA or corporate PPA, and sell it to tenants or third parties. You do need to, and there is also an exemption if you generate your own power and sell it to tenants or third parties. You do need to keep it simple and be careful with structures. The exemptions are easiest to satisfy in a simple point-to-point structure. So if you put your renewable generation in a separate corporate entity, then it can break the exemptions. The top two in red are not impossible, but they are more complex and there's less certainty on interpretation. There are quantity limits on reselling private wire power, and in fact, most private wire PPAs will expressly prohibit you from on-selling. Stacking the various exemptions within the legislation is also theoretically possible, but it often comes down to your advisor's views on interpretation of the language, and it's not clear-cut. So the message here is to approach the top two with caution and take some advice before you do it. So let's move on then to low carbon heat options, which are much less risky because at the moment, at least, heat is not regulated. So on the next slide, we have the list of options that I'm going to look at, starting at the top with the more centralized solutions, district heat network or a sort of ambient loop network, moving down to communal heat system and the completely standalone individual heat pumps. So looking first at district heat network on the next slide. This is the most centralised option and involves heat and hot water supply directly to multiple buildings from a centralised energy centre using insulated pipes. And this is often higher temperature, so 50 degrees plus. So you have heat interface units or heat exchangers, depending on scale, at buildings. These are suitable for high heat density areas such as urban centres with high heat loads. And examples of these would be Aberdeen Heat and Power or the Glenrothes Energy Network. The benefit of district heating is that it's a heat as a service model, so it avoids life cycle costs of boiler replacement, and it also provides long-term price stability. In theory, also, it means your supplier is actually responsible for decarbonisation. So you've done the decarbonisation bit by connecting to the heat network, and then the heat network has to continue to try and make that as low carbon as possible. In terms of things to think about, district heating does create a natural monopoly with a sole supplier. And at the moment, that can be challenging for customers because heat is unregulated. And we've seen a lot of public sector schemes for that reason. Heat regulation is coming, though, with Ofgem starting implementation from January next year. If you're a large property and are therefore treated as an anchor load, which is a property with a high heat demand and a creditworthy entity, then those properties tend to underpin the network and are expected to sign longer term contracts. And there may also be a requirement to take a minimum amount of heat with take or pay arrangements. As with power, you need to think about who's going to produce backup supply. Do you need to retain your existing boiler plant in case something goes wrong, or is that going to be provided from the network? And with all of these, the recurring theme will be checking that the supply is compatible with your building heating system or whether you need to make changes to enable you to connect. And finally, with a heat network, you also need to know, well, where's the network? If you want to connect to a network, is there a network that you can actually connect to? If you are thinking about options now, then it makes sense to consider whether you're likely to be in a heat network zone. Indicative zones were set out in the local heat and energy efficiency strategies published by every local authority. And so you can look those up, they're published on their websites, and get an idea of whether your property is in or near a likely zone. As Catherine said right at the top, the policy in Scotland on what it means to be in a zone is still developing, but it's possible that large non-domestic buildings may be required to connect if it's technically feasible and cost effective. And that's certainly what the policy is in England. So moving on to the next one, which is the decentralised system or ambient loop. And this refers to a scheme where there's lower ambient temperature water supplied to multiple buildings. So that can be heat from waste heat sources, from sewers or boreholes. And then you have individual water source heat pumps at the buildings that connect into the ambient loop and convert the low temperature heat to high temperature. It's more efficient than having a standalone heat pump. It's most suited to new builds and refurbished properties because it tends to have a lower input temperature. And examples of that we've seen are at the Clyde's Gateway Regeneration Area in Dalmarnock and at the Advanced Manufacturing and Innovation District in Renfrewshire. It's also being proposed now quite a lot for new build domestic. So the benefits of this is potentially more efficient than a standalone heat pump option. You also have the flexibility to change electricity supplier or install your own renewable generation to power the heat pump. And it can, if you prefer, be delivered as a heat as a service model, avoiding the life cycle cost in the pump. So there's a bit of flexibility there. It does create, in terms of things to think about, a natural monopoly for a sole supplier, but only for access to the ambient loop, depending on how it's structured. So again, you will probably need long-term contracts and similar thinking around how are you going to get backup supply? Will the heat pump work if the ambient loop falls over? And is the supply compatible with your building heating system? So then moving on to a communal heating system. This is now into hopefully a bit more familiar territory. This is where heat and hot water are supplied to multiple flats or multiple offices within a single building. You have a centralised plant room to generate the heat with HIUs, heat interface units, at individual premises. This can be combined with a district heat network if you wanted, so you can have the connection coming into the plant room and then supply it around the building, or it can be a standalone solution. It tends to be more efficient than having multiple heat sources within a single building, and it provides a heat as a service model for tenants to avoid the life cycle cost of individual boiler replacement. And as I said, this is a well understood model. It's quite common in flats. In terms of things to think about, again, it does create that natural monopoly, but that's often linked to the landlord or factor, so perhaps less risk because that's an established structure. You do need to think about who is going to contribute to life cycle replacement costs and how much. And as with all of them, making sure that the system is compatible with the building heating system. And finally, moving on to the standalone solution. This is the simplest one, and again, you'll be delighted to hear, probably don't need to phone the lawyers for this one. Most commonly, we're talking about individual air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps. I like to think of it as a fridge in reverse. These work best with well-insulated new build properties with low heat demand, where district heating just might not be economic. The benefits here, there's no monopoly, you pay for your own electricity and run the pumps. And one thing that could be thought about with the standalone solution is how you combine your heat and power options. So you could combine a heat pump with solar panels on the roof and some battery storage to reduce your electricity costs and optimize your heat cost overall. Octopus as a supplier are already offering these types of solutions to domestic customers and have marketed them as zero bill homes. In terms of things to think about, the key thing is the building type, so making sure that your heating system can work with the lower temperature heats generally supplied from a heat pump. You'd be responsible for the higher upfront capital cost, particularly until deployment increases and the cost of these heat pumps comes down. You retain, because it's standalone, the equipment failure risk, and so life cycle replacement cost needs to be considered too. So on the final slide, just some drivers that might point you towards a decentralized or standalone solution. Decarbonisation. In theory, all these solutions should be zero direct emission heating. So zero emission at your building, but the carbon content depends on the heat source or the power used to generate the heat, including any backup solution. Costs and tariffs, obviously critically important. And of course, the more energy efficient your property has to start with, then the cost will reduce. Network tariffs from a district heating network can be designed to be individual solutions, particularly if it's a really big network with lots of commercial customers. Equally, those individual solutions could be really cost effective if you can optimize with your electricity solution. Availability, you need to have a heat network if you want to connect to one. Project economics, that's important because it has to stack up for it to enable a network to be built, so a level of heat density is required. Technical compatibility, I've talked about that. In each case, you need to make sure that the solution is compatible with your heat system, and controls are likely to be quite important there too. Life cycle replacement, the network solution often provides heat as a service model, whereas if you are looking at a standalone solution, then you'll have to think about life cycle costs. And finally, freedom of choice. Building heat solutions give customers freedom to choose new technologies and to choose utility suppliers. The networks create unregulated monopolies, although regulation may increase consumer confidence, and there's economies of scale in terms of those heat networks decarbonising at scale. So on that, I will hand back to Catherine for questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Sarah Jane and Callum. I think we've got time for maybe just a couple of questions. Sarah Jane, I'll give you just a wee breather for now. Callum, so when working with clients, what renewable options have you seen them opting for?
So this is maybe reflective of the client base I generally work for, but the most common I deal with is probably solar panels, and generally the mechanism the clients opt for is a third party to supply and install those and maintain the equipment, and then the client would buy the power under a power purchase agreement. And I think clients like this for a couple of reasons. One is obviously the green credentials, and two, it's a way for them to generate some extra income at the building from space that was otherwise not being used. You know, so if you're putting solar panels on the roof, the supplier of the panels is normally able to sell any excess electricity created back to the grid, and our clients have been able to negotiate a percentage of that onward sale price. So it creates a revenue stream for the client that they can capitalise.
Understandable. Sarah Jane, one for you. So you mentioned that heat so far is largely unregulated. So what's the risk of signing up to a heat network ahead of the regulations coming in?
So it's not quite the Wild West at the moment, but it does require a little bit more thought than your power options. You know, if you get power supplied to your site from a licensed supplier, then you know they're covered by the regulations, and you probably don't give their T's and C's terribly much thought. With heat, you can't really do that because the regulatory gaps need to be plugged by contract. So you need to think about what happens if your supplier goes bust, who's going to continue to supply your heat. So looking at contractual step-in rights. You need to have good contractual controls on tariffs and tariff increases because those aren't regulated at the moment. And because there's no regulation giving heat network operators statutory powers, all of the property rights that they need for their energy centre, their pipes, their infrastructure needs to be one-to-one negotiated with you. So there's a bit more to do. You need to be a bit more hands-on to make sure that the contracts and the solutions meet your needs ahead of the regulation coming in, as well as having change in law protection to make sure that once the regulations do come in, everything still works.
And we have more questions, but I think we'll follow up with those. I'm just looking at the time. If that's all right, we'll follow up with those questions after the webinar. But meanwhile, it's just for me to say thank you very much for watching our renewable energy options for servicing commercial property. We hope you found it useful. If you would like to find out any more information about the content or anything else on this topic, please contact our speakers. Their details are there. And also, could you please complete our feedback form that will pop up at the end, and you can let us know what you thought of this and if there are any other topics you would like us to cover in the future. So, and finally, it's just for me to say thank you to our speakers, Sarah Jane and Callum, and thank you to all of you for joining today. Thank you very much. Bye for now.